All right, welcome to part two of our build design system series. And today we're actually going to look at building out some of our components. So starting off with some more basic form components. So we're going to start off by looking at our label, our field. We're then going to combine our label and our field into build and input. We're also going to look at our button and our button icon, our menu, our dropdown, our checkbox, and then upcoming in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at part three, where we get into some more advanced componentry. So looking at our date picker, our define field, our autocomplete text entry, switch, radio buttons, and then our complete form component. So be sure to subscribe for that. Let's dive right in.
All right, so let's get started building our input component. Now, our input component is actually going to be structured into several different components. So I'll show you what I mean here real quick. And this is the process that we're actually going to go through together. So say I have an input field here, make this a little bit rounder. So maybe that's an input. That's going to be one component in itself. Then your label here, this is going to be another component. And then combined, these are going to make one larger component. So that's the structure that we're going to be working with here to start. And what we're going to do right now is go ahead and actually build out our label component here. So I'm going to start off by adding some text to canvas, and let's just call it label for now. So again, this is the label that will sit above that input field, letting the user know what that input is for, whether it's an email, so on, and so forth. So we have our label here. I'm going to go ahead and apply, which one do I want to go with here? Let's go with the medium semi-bold, just like that. Now let's also go ahead and add an icon here, an information icon. So let me go ahead. One thing I am using is actually the central icon system. This is one of my favorite icons to use in building out design systems and working with clients. It's a ton of great variants, a lot of great icons as well across different weights, sizes, so on and so forth. Again, I'll put a link for this also in the description. So let's go ahead and find a question, a little info question. Something like this, I think will work just fine. And again, what you can actually do is adjust the radiuses to make it a little bit more round. If you want it sort of that more crisp, I like mine a little bit more round, something like that. And let's go ahead and set this to our icon information. Something like that, I think works just fine. So let's go ahead then and group the two of these. So we're going to right click or select both, shift, and then add some, or shift A to add some auto layout there. Now we need to adjust some of these elements here. So let's start off by setting it to hug so that those things sit nicely, and we're going to adjust the spacing of our gap. Now, one thing you might be noticing here is we're not actually using a variable for our gap or for our padding, because usually we only want to use the variables in a responsive collection for items that are going to be responsive based on device size. You know, I don't anticipate this gap for a label being adjusted from 12 to 8 when going on mobile. So I'm going to leave that as 12 for now. And that's a good lesson when it comes to your variables, is not absolutely everything needs a variable. So let's go ahead and call this our none. And you're going to see why in just a second. But first, let's go ahead and make sure everything is set up. Yep, that works just fine. Let's go ahead and create the component of this. Let's copy a property for testing. And one thing we want to actually do is set a text property so that we can easily change the value of the label. So let's call it value label, or name, let's call it label. And we'll set the value to label for now. So now when I hit this, one thing you'll notice is I easily have the ability to change this to something like an email, or if let's type in phone number, there we go. And I can see that because I set the label to hug, what's going to happen is that's going to also adjust with it. So now that we have our base label out of the way, let's look at adding some variants to this label. All right, so now let's look at adding some variants to our label. So I'm going to go ahead and add a variant, and this is actually going to be our none variant, and you'll see why in just a sec. Let me retype that, and let's change property 1 to type, and I just don't know why I called that none originally, because this should be our label. So there's 3 variants we're going to focus on today, and the first is going to be our required, so when this field is required. So what I'm going to do is add some text to the right here, and just add in an asterisk. So I'm on a Mac, and I pressed Shift and then 8. So let's go ahead and set this to our icon air. Again, we're making a design system, not the best looking design system, so bear with me. And let's go ahead and then flatten this. Let's then drag this into our label itself. And when I do that, I can see that it's added. So it looks required, but I think we don't necessarily need this gap here. And I'll show you why. So if you have an input field with a label, there we go. So let's say there's our label, there's our input field. if the field is required, what you don't want to have happen is your label actually shifted in this way to make room for that asterisk. Because now all of a sudden, everything's going to look out of line as it just does right here. You want your labels to be in line with each other. So what we're actually going to do is select our asterisks here and then absolute position. Then using just our keyboard, we're going to move these a couple pixels to the left. Let me, there we go. So now if I have multiple labels, and let's rename this one to required. Required. There we go. Now if I set this to required, I can see that our labels stay in line, but then our little asterisk here to let the user know that it's required falls outside of that line using the absolute positioning, so it doesn't adjust our label altogether. So make sure I applied style. Yep, there we go. All right, so there we have our required. Next, what we're going to look at is our optional. So if the field is optional, so let's go ahead and add in some text here to the right-hand side. Optional. What we'll do, we won't do the semi-bold. We'll maybe just go with a body medium, and we want the text to be gray. So maybe let's set it to disabled. So I'm going to go ahead and take this and then copy it inside. There we go. Let's go ahead and set this to hug. I see that set to hug as well. And we'll put our optional in brackets. There we go. So I renamed this to optional. I did indeed. So there we have the labels that will go into our input or field component here. So I can see I have my none, where it really just is that, one thing I didn't go ahead and here and do is actually apply any of my styles here. So for the color, so forgive me for that. So let's go ahead and apply our text headings. There we go. We have our text headings, and then we also have our text headings. There we go. So we have our icon information, and one thing we also might want to do as well is also add in a layer property here for each of the elements. So I'm going to go ahead and hit tooltip, if whether or not we want to show that or not. So let's go ahead and apply that. So tooltip. So now with each of my elements here, I have the option to change between the none, the required, the optional, hide the tooltip or not for each of these elements, and also adjust the label as well. So there we go. There we have our label component that will go into our input and fields. So now that we have our label component, let's go ahead and build our field component that will combine with our label to build our input. So let's go ahead and add in just some text to the canvas to start. So we're going to make sure that that's set to our body medium, and let's go ahead and set this to our text disabled. Let's now go ahead and add in some icons. So I'm going to add in a person icon and then also an eye icon as well, and you'll be able to swap these out very shortly, and I'm going to show you how to do that as well. Let's now select all of our elements and add an auto layout frame. Let's then make sure these are aligned, and let's set this to hug and hug. What we're going to do next is let's add some auto layout here. So we're going to set a gap to 8, horizontal padding to 12, and a vertical padding to 8 as well. One thing I'm not going to be doing is adding individual variables at the auto layout level for components that aren't really going to change in responsive device sizes. You can if you want to. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm just not going to be doing it here. But for some of our components that will adjust based on the type of device size, most notably items like cards, I will, of course, use some variables here at that auto layout level, and we'll get into that a little bit later on in the series. Let's go ahead and add a fill, and let's set this to a surface primary, and let's add a stroke. Let's go with apply the variable. So let's look for our border width. We'll set that to 1, and let's set our border radius to that medium. It's nice 4. Let's now go ahead and adjust the colors. So starting with our stroke, we're going to use a border primary, and now let's adjust the colors inside. So I can see that our text is set to that text disabled. Let's then go ahead and adjust those icons, and we're going to set those to our icon primary to start. Okay, so I think we're looking pretty good here. Let's go ahead and call this our field. Then let's go ahead and create the component of this and do a little bit of testing. Now, if I drag this out, notice how the icon doesn't follow with it. And what that would actually do is that would create, as you have multiple forms, let me maybe adjust this to just email, and then this to first name. what this would do is it would cause those icons to be staggered, which would create a really, really awkward form. So what we want to set the placeholder text to on our main component, horizontal restraint to that fill, and that's going to keep those icons right aligned and our fields or forms looking a little bit more consistent, a little bit more crisp. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add in some properties. We always want to be able to, when you click on one of those instances, easily, change this placeholder copy, change the icons, and also hide the icons as well. So let's go ahead and look at those properties, starting with our placeholder. So let's create a property for our placeholder. Placeholder, there we go. And now when I can see that on the right-hand side, when I click one of these instances, I easily have the ability to adjust that. Now, let's focus on the icons as well. And when it comes to our icons, we want two sets of properties associated with each. One of which is a layer property to hide that icon, and the other is an instant swap to easily swap that icon in and out. So let's start with our icon left. So I'm going to go here, select one, and under layer, add in that Boolean property for layer. And we're simply going to call that icon left. So now when I hit an instance, I can see I can easily swap that. I can easily hide that and re-show that icon. Let's then also add an instant swap. So again, select, and here you'll see this icon here to create that instant swap property. And we're also going to call that icon left, but we can't have properties with the same name. So what I actually like to do, and I know there's a hotkey to add in emojis and symbols, but I just do edit in emojis and symbols anyway, is add in a little downward arrow to show you that one property is really associated with the other. So when I hide that icon left, I can no longer swap out that icon here with a different type of icon. Let's now do the same for that icon right. So the exact same process. Let's add the layer property for icon right, and then let's go ahead and add in an instant swap. Call that icon right. And let's add in that downward arrow. And again, edit, and then emojis and symbols. It's just the process I do. I do know there's a hotkey for it, so bear with me. There we go. So now I can toggle on and off that icon right, swap out that icon right for some random icon. Do the same with our icon left, and I can also adjust the placeholder copy as well with ease. Beautiful. So we have our main component for our field. Next, let's look at adding some variants. Add in our variants now for our field. And one thing I did notice before is we actually had our stroke set to inside, so I just went ahead and set that to outside. So apologies for that mistake. We're going to make some mistakes as we go along. We'll just go back and make sure to fix those as we proceed forward. So there's two types of variants we're going to focus on today, one of which is our status variant. So things like our default state, our hover state, our focus state, so on and so forth. And then the second is whether or not text has actually been entered into this field. So an unfilled state and then a filled state. And we're going to cover all of these together. So let's go ahead and add a variant here. And one thing I always like to do is I always like to sort of have this structure here as I'm building out my variants to keep them nice and organized. So this here is going to be our default, and then this second one will be our hover. So let's change property 1 here to status. And when it comes to the name of the property, I always like to have the first letter uppercase, but the name of the variant all lowercase. So we have our default. Now let's go ahead and focus in on our hover. So for our hover, the only thing that's going to change is our border. So this will become our border action hover. And maybe just as an example here, maybe I also wanted these icons to have a hover variable. Now, if we go into our local variables here, I can see that our icon does not have an action hover, but our text does. Now, it's not terribly uncommon for designers and those building out design systems to use text variables on their icons. But just for the purposes of keeping things consistent, and also too, just to show you how you can evolve your design system as we go, let's go ahead and add in another icon variable to match that text. So an action hover, which is going to be that primary 600. So let's go ahead, set that to our primary 600. And now let's go ahead and apply that variable to those icons. So it'll become our icon action hover. That easy. And we'll rename this to our hover. Beautiful. Next, let's go ahead and look at our focus. So for our focus, if you're not too sure what this variant is referring to, it's almost like a lightning quick interaction that happens whenever you press one of these fields. So it happens really quickly, then it goes away. There's tons of great resources online about focus states if you're not too familiar about them. And usually it's not one that enters into your prototype. It's usually one that happens more on the dev side, and they're often curious about what that focus state would be. So when it comes to your focus, let's go ahead and add in a rectangle, set that to 1 pixel, which is our border width, 1 pixel on the outside, and we're going to set that to our border focus. Let's drop the fill entirely, and let's also apply our variable for our border radius. There we go. And let's simply copy, delete, and then paste in. Now, this, of course, is not right. So we're going to use the absolute positioning tool to just position that focus border rectangle 2 pixels on the outside. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. There we go. So I can see it's 2 pixels on either side. So now let's do a quick test here real quick. And maybe I actually want this focus state to be a little bit more bold. So let's first off rename our rectangle here to focus. And maybe we want it 2 pixels. We'll try that. I think that's almost a little bit better. Yeah, I kind of like the little bit of a more bold focus there. Okay, so if I was to, on the symbol or instance of our component, adjust the size of our field, notice how that focus state sort of stays where it is. And the reason being is we didn't adjust the constraints. So let's go ahead and adjust the constraints here to top and bottom, and then also to left and right. And then I can see that that focus adjusts with it and follows that field wherever it goes. So we've got our focus. Next, let's go ahead and look at our success. So let's bring in one of these. This will be, we're going to look at our error first before our success. So our status error, let's change the border to our border error. Let's change the icon to our icon error. And let me just make sure no other changes here. Sorry, I do have a little bit of a cheat sheet just to make sure I don't lead you astray. And yeah, I think we're good for the error. Awesome. So let's do the same for our success, but instead of the error, we're really just going to change it to our success variables. So this will become our border success, and then this will become our icon success. And then let's also do our disabled as well. So let's bring in our default here. So with this disabled, there we go. So let's go ahead and adjust this to our surface primary, to our surface disabled. Let's also keep the border primary as is, and then let's go with our text disabled as it is, and maybe we want an icon disabled as well. So I can see that we don't have an icon disabled, we only have that icon primary. So let's go ahead and look at our local variables here. For our text, I can see we have a disabled here, and then an on disabled. So we're going to actually recreate the on disabled for our icon, so that neutral 700. So we have an icon on disabled, and this will be our neutral 700. Oops, if I can't type, that neutral 700. Again, just to create some consistencies. And then let's apply that icon on disabled. So when those icons are on a disabled state or variant, what is the color that those should be referring to? There we go. So it looks like we have all our different status variants all set up. So I can see the default hover, focus, error, success, and disabled. I can see that one thing that happened, this is usually a Figma bug. Sometimes it just rearranges those properties that we had set earlier on. So let's just go ahead and group those together. So our icon left with our icon left, and then our icon right with our icon right. And then there we go. So we have all of our status variants for our field. And next what we're going to do is actually look at our states. So unfilled versus filled. Okay, so next let's go ahead and look at adding in our second variant, which is going to be our state. So we're going to add in a state variant, and the first value is going to be not filled. And these are all going to be our not filled variants because, again, no text has actually been entered in to any of our variants here. So when it comes to your filled in variants, there's not a ton of differences. Really just going to be adjusting the surface colors and the text colors. So for our text, instead of text disabled, we're actually going to set that to our text body to give that text a little bit of a darker appearance to let the user know that some text has actually been entered in. So that's really all we are simply going to change there. So next, let's do the same for our hover. And this is going to be our filled. Now, for our hover, we're going to do a couple things here. So the text disabled is also going to become the text body, but maybe I also want to add in a surface background for this. So instead of a surface primary, I'm going to add in a surface action hover. Now, that doesn't look right, does it? So when it comes to your hover effects, one thing that I always like to have in my variables, and I actually left this out on purpose when we were actually building out this variable library, again, just to show you how some of your variables can evolve, as maybe you have an action hover, but maybe also you want a lighter shade, so an action hover 2. What you can do is go ahead, simply create that variable here. Oops, that's for our text, not for our surface. So let's go ahead, find that surface action hover, and then a surface action 2, and let's maybe set that to a little bit of a lighter shade, and then adjust that to the surface action 2, and now I have a lighter effect for that hover. So that easy. Next, what we're going to do is do our focus, and the focus is going to be very similar to our defaults. So this is going to be our filled in state, where the text is simply going to become our text body. Again, just slightly darker. For our air, something very, very similar that we did with our hover. So this is going to be our filled, but we are going to adjust the surface to our surface air, and then our text disabled to our text body. Same thing for our success. Let's make, this is going to be our success filled. Let's change that surface to that surface success, and then that text to that text body. And then for that disabled, let's go ahead and make some slight adjustments here. And let me just double check the variables that we're going to be adding. So for this as well, we're also going to be adding, instead of changing it to our text body, we're changing it to our text on disabled. And this is going to be our disabled filled in variant. There we go. So it looks like we're doing pretty good here. So let me just pull in one of these to test them out. So I can see I can change the status. I can also change the state as well, whether it's filled or not filled. And I think we're looking overall pretty good because we can adjust the icons as we need to. And if I go in here, I can see that our icon always stays right aligned. So beautiful. We have our field components. Next, what we're going to look at doing is build out our input component by combining our label and field. All right, now let's go ahead and build out our input component. So combining our label components and then also our field components that we just built into one. So when it comes to your input component, sometimes what I also like to add in is a little hint copy. So hint copy that will go slightly above the field. Again, it's going to be an optional element. So if you need to explain a little bit what this field is referring to, you're going to have that option. So we're going to keep that at our body medium, and then we're going to set the text color to our text disabled, just so it's a little bit lighter. Let's go ahead, select all three of these, and then add some auto layout. We'll keep that gap at 8. I think that's fine. And let's go ahead and call this inputs, create the component of this, and bring a symbol down for testing. So let's look at so I can see our hint copy here. So you can see this is set to fill. Let's set that to hug. And then as we did a little bit earlier on, we're going to add in some properties to this hint copy because you don't always need this hint copy showing, especially if the field is something as simple as a first name. So let's start off with adding a layer property for hint copy and create that property. And now I can toggle that on and off. And let's also add a text property as well for hint copy. And because you can't have two properties with the same name, we're going to go ahead and bring in that arrow. There we go. So I can turn on and off that hint copy and also adjust that hint copy as well. One thing here I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and set this to fill, and I think we're looking in some pretty good shape. One thing you'll notice here is when we were building out our field and our label, we had all these great properties associated with our field and then also our label. And when we hit our instance once, all of a sudden we've lost those properties. So let's go ahead and add in some nested instances to our properties. So select the main component, under properties, hit the plus, and then nested instances, and simply just turn on label and field. So now when I hit our instance once, I can see we have all those properties to choose from. And there we go. There we have our input component. Okay, so next let's go ahead and look at building out our button component. So I'm going to add some text here, and then let's also add some icons as well. So not a field, maybe we'll just go ahead and add in, I don't know, like a heart or something. Let's icon system. There we go. So let's add in 2 hearts here on either side of our button. Let's then go ahead and select all of these and add some auto layout. Let's then go ahead and adjust. We want this set to hug and hug. And sometimes whenever you add auto layout, Figma decides to add one of your icons in an absolute position for whatever reason. So I don't know why. It just does. Okay, so now let's go ahead and adjust our auto layout here. So we're going to set a gap to 12, a horizontal padding to 24, and then a vertical padding to 12. And I can see that our button is coming along nice and fine. Let's now go ahead and add a fill. So for our fill, we're going to go with our surface action. And then for our text, let's go with a text on action. And let's go ahead and look at our icons here. So for our icons, I can see we don't have an icon on action. So let's go ahead and add one of those into our variables. So let's add an icon on action and then set that to white. So that neutral white. There we go. So now let's go ahead and simply apply that icon on action. And I can see that our button is coming along just fine. Let's also add a corner radius that we are going to set to that 4. Let's call this button. Go ahead and create the component of this. Bring down a symbol for testing. And now let's go ahead and look at our properties. So something that we did very similar to our field component. So starting off with a text property for this button text, again, to easily change whatever the text is. So whether it's click me, learn more, so on and so forth. So we're going to go and call this our label. And now I can go ahead and change this to something like click me. And now let's add in some layer properties for both of our icons. So very similar to what we did with our field, both a layer property and then an instant swap property for both your icon left and your icon right. So starting with our icon left, there we go. So we have that layer property and then also an instant swap because you can't have 2 properties with the same name. Let's add in our arrow. Oops, not icon right. This should become our, let's detach that. This should become our icon left. Thanks for calling me out behind the scenes there. There we go. So I can see we have our icon left, and I can easily adjust that icon out as well. Perfect. So now let's do the same for our icon right. So let's add in a layer property for our icon right. So now I can see I can turn this on and off. And let's go ahead and add in that instant swap. And we're just going to assign the icon right that we made by accident. Okay, so let's go ahead and just rearrange these real quick. So our icon right is associated with our icon right, and our icon left is associated with our icon left. So now I can see that I can turn on and off that icon left. Same with the icon right. I can swap both of those out, and I can adjust learn more, and then I can adjust the button label as well. And because our text is set to hug and hug, I can see that the button expands and collapses as that text evolves. So perfect. We have our button all set up. Next, let's go ahead and look at adding our status. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at adding our variants here. Now, very similar to our field, we're going to have multiple sets of variants, and the first one we're going to focus on is our status. So let's go ahead and create a variant here. So let's bring these up. Oops, let's bring this up. So the first one that we have here is our defaults, and then we're also going to look at a hover, but let's go ahead and change that property 1 to status. This is going to be our default with that lowercase d. And then we're also going to have a hover. There we go. So here we have our hover. And for our hover, the only thing that we're going to do to adjust is simply adjust that surface to that surface action hover. Everything else is going to stay the exact same. Let's then look at it disabled. So, oops, let's not do that. Let's bring in an instance here, and this is going to be our disabled. This is our disabled. So for our disabled, we're going to go ahead and apply some of our disabled variants. So our fill will become our surface, or will become our surface disabled. Our text on action will become our text on disabled. And then our icon on action will become our icon on disabled. There we go. So that's simple. Next, what we're going to do is go ahead and look at our focus. And for our focus, let's not copy our disabled, but it's going to be very similar to our defaults. So this is going to be our focus. And then as we did with our field, we're going to copy that very similar type of logic. We're going to have a box around the outside. So we have our focus. Let's add in a rectangle. Let's add a stroke, drop the fill. We're going to apply a variable to our border width. And we're going to make that 2 pixels on the outside. Let's apply a radius variable, which is going to be that 4. And let's set the stroke to a border focus. Awesome. So let's copy and paste this inside. Again, of course, that doesn't work. So we're going to use our absolute positioning to adjust our border, or our focus border, so that it comes 2 pixels on either side. 1, 2, 1, 2. Where's the end here? 1, 2. And then we have our 1, 2. And always be sure to set those constraints. So we're going to have it on the left and right, and also the top and bottom as well. And let's just do a quick check here. And for whatever reason, Figma decided to also rearrange our properties again. So we got to go back and adjust that. So let's have our label, our status, our icon lefts. Oops. And then our icon rights. So now I can adjust the label here to something like click me. If I can spell click me. I can adjust the status, and I can also turn on and off those icons. Okay, so we have our initial status variants here. So next what we're going to do is go ahead and actually look at our type variants. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add in our type variants here. Now, this group of buttons that we just built, these are going to be our primary buttons. So let's go ahead and add in a new variant that we're going to call type. And then this first value is going to be our primary. So then I can see when I hit this symbol or instance of our component, I can see that we have a primary type. So there's 2 other types that we're going to look at. First is going to be a transparent, and then also an outline. So let's start off with the transparent here. So let's bring this down, and this is going to be our transparent. Transparent. There we go. So then we're just going to take each of our original primaries and then make a copy of each. And then this is going to be our transparent. There we go. So for a transparent, what we're going to do is actually just drop that fill entirely, and then set the text on action to our text action, and our icon on action to our icon action. And I can see that I don't have an icon action. So let's go ahead and build that. So let's go in our local variables. Let's confirm what color our text action is. This is a primary default. So we're going to have an icon action as well. And this is going to be that primary default. There we go. So now we have the icon color. So we have an icon on action. That's what it's set to now. Then let's set that to an icon action. And then there we have our transparent default. Let's then do something very similar for our hover. But for our hover, we might still want to have a little bit of a, let's bring this down here. We might still want to have a little bit of a background for that hover itself, but maybe not as strong as the current hover here. So let's be sure to set that to our hover transparent. And instead of the surface action hover, we're going to set that to a surface action hover 2. And then let's go ahead, apply variables. So the icon on action will become our icon on action hover. And then our text on action will become our text action hover. There we go. So really that simple. So then there we have our transparent hover. Let's then also look at our disabled. So let's bring down a copy of our disabled, set this to our transparent. There we go. And let's simply drop that fill altogether. and we're going to leave our icon on disabled and text on disabled as they are. Then let's bring down our focus. So for our focus, what we're going to do, let's call this our focus transparent, is we're going to drop that fill and then change our icon on action to what we did with our default. So this is going to become our icon on action and our text action. So our icon action and then our text action. There we go. And there we have our focus state. One thing I realized here is I didn't rename a rectangle to focus. So always be sure to do that just for naming consistency purposes. There we go. So then there we have our transparent buttons. And now I can see that I can adjust the type for our default, our hover, our disabled, and then also our focus. Next, what we're going to do is look at our outline types. Okay, so next let's go ahead and add in our outline variants. So what we're going to do for our outline is actually just copy our transparents, each of these, and then bring these down, and then these are going to be our outline. So for our outline, again, very, very similar to our transparent. They just really just have an outline. So let's go ahead and add a stroke. Let's set it to the outside, and we're going to, apply a variable where border width. We're going to set that, let's go maybe 2 pixels. Maybe we'll actually just go 1 pixel for now. Again, we can always come back and adjust a little bit later on. And let's apply a variable to our stroke. So this is going to be our border action. For this one, it's going to be again, 1 pixel. Be sure to apply your variable. Apply that variable, our border width. 1 pixel on the outside. And this is going to be our border action hover. There we go. And then for our disabled, one thing I'm actually going to go ahead and do here is actually maybe just bring back in that fill. So I'm going to apply fill, and this is going to be our surface disabled. And now let's go ahead and apply a quick stroke. So we're going to go ahead and apply, there we go, 1 pixel, our small variable or border width variable on the outside. And then this is going to be our border disabled. And then lastly, very similar to what we did with our default, we're going to do the same for our focus. So add in that stroke, which is going to be 1 pixel border width, 1 pixel on the outside. And then let's go ahead and apply that to our border action. There we go. So I think we're in some pretty good shape. So now what I can see here, we have between our outlines, we have our transparents, and then we also have our primaries for our disabled, our hover, and then also our default as well. And I can see here Figma didn't decide to mess with the layout of our properties. So I think we're in some pretty good shape. Awesome. So there we have our button components, but we're not quite done with our buttons yet, as we still need our button icons, and that's what we are going to do together next. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at our button icons. Let's go ahead and bring in that same icon itself. Now, one thing that you might see as well, one thing I'm not going to cover today, sometimes designers in building out their design system, they like to have the buttons within the icons within their button, a little bit smaller than their button icons. But for today, we're just going to have both set to that 24 by 24, just so you have that option to adjust whether or not you want that one bigger or one smaller. Okay, so let's then go ahead and on our main icon that we just brought in here, let's go ahead and just add some auto layout to it. Let's set the horizontal padding to 12 and the vertical padding also to 12 to keep that nice square shape. Let's go ahead and add in a fill. That fill is going to be our surface action to start. So very similar to what we did with our primary button, our default primary. And then let's go ahead and add in an icon on action. Let's then go ahead, apply a quick radius. So let's set that radius to 4. Let's call this our button icon. Go ahead and create the component of this. And the only property that we're going to add here is that instant swap property. So on our icon, let's go ahead and, there we go. Let's add in that instant swap for our icon. So now I can easily swap in and out that icon with a different icon, should I choose to. And then there we have our basic button icon. And next what we're going to do is actually go ahead and, very similar to what we did with our button, is we are going to apply very, very similar variants. Okay, so now let's go ahead and add in our variants here. So let's copy very, very similar, the exact same really variant structure that we did for our buttons for our button icon. Let's then go ahead, of course, and create the component of this. And let's extend this out just so everything fits in nicely. Might not need as much space, but it's whatever. There we go. So this is going to be, there we go. Sorry, I'm just getting picky. So this is going to be our status. And then let's go ahead and do the same for, this will be our default. And then this here will be our hover. So let's go ahead and do the exact same as we did for our buttons, but for our button icon. So for our hover with our button, I can see we had a surface action hover and then an icon on action. So let's go ahead and do the same. So our icon on action and then our surface action hover. And that's hover, set to hover, perfect. Let's do the same thing for our disabled. So this will be our status disabled, where I can see we had a surface disabled and then an icon on disabled. So this will become our surface disabled and then our icon on disabled. And then let's do also the same with our focus as well. So we got to make sure we add that 2 pixels on either side. Let's copy this. This will be our focus. And now let's go ahead, zoom in here and bring in our focus element. So let's add a stroke, which is going to be 2 pixels border width. Sorry, I should really color scope my variants here, or my variables on the outside. And this is going to be our border focus. And let's apply the border radius of 4, and then drop that fill entirely. Let's copy, delete, and then paste in, and then use our absolute positioning to get that 2 pixels on either side. 1, 2. Now comes the tedious part. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. Oops. Oh, I was already at set to 2. Perfect. And then always be sure to set those constraints to left and right, top and bottom, just always best practice. And then there I can see we have our button icon primary for, let's always test a symbol for testing. So I can see we have our status default, status hover, status disabled, and then also our status focus. And we can easily adjust that icon as well, should we need to. Okay, beautiful. So next what we're going to do is look at our transparent and also our outline for our button icon. Let's go ahead and add in our transparent and outline button variants. So let's add in a type variant. Actually, in these values are all, these values here are all going to get set to our primary. And now for our transparent outline, we're really just going to do the exact same thing as we did with the buttons above it, but for our icons. So let's copy a version of each, and these are going to be our transparent. And now let's match the styling. So let's go ahead and drop that surface action and put our icon on action to our icon action. For our hover, our surface action hover is going to become our surface action 2, our surface action hover 2, and then our icon on action is going to become our icon action hover. For our disabled, we're just going to drop the surface entirely and keep the icon on disabled as it is. And then for our focus, we're simply going to drop that fill and set our icon on action to our icon action, which matches what we did with that default. So there we have all of our different transparents. And now let's go ahead and do the outline. So these will be our outline. So let's just confirm what we did here. So we have 1 pixel on the outside, was set to a border action. So this is going to be add a stroke. This is going to be our border width, 1 pixel on the outside. And this is going to be our border action. For our button, what we did the exact same as we did for our transparents, but we just have that border action hover. So let's go ahead and add that stroke, which is going to be border width, 1 pixel on the outside. And this is going to be our border action hover. There we go. For our disabled, what we did is we brought back in that fill and just added in that surface or that border disabled. So let's bring back that fill. This is going to be our surface disabled, and let's add a stroke. Border width, 1 pixel on the outside, and this is going to be our border disabled. And then for our focus, let's go ahead and very similar to what we did with our default, let's just simply bring back in that stroke. Apply the variable, border width. I should really color scope or variable scope these, so I don't need to keep searching for it. But anyways, so this will be 1 pixel on the outside, and we're going to set this to our border action. So as we did with our default. So there we go. There we have all of our different variants for our button icon. So let's bring one of these down for testing here real quick. So I can now swap between the different statuses, and I can also swap between the different types as well. One thing I would just like to go ahead and confirm before we continue on is I didn't rename our rectangles to focus. So let's go ahead and do that. It's always something that I actually end up always leaving to the end because I forget to do it as we go, but it's always a good idea to be nice and consistent here. So this is going to be our focus. There we go. Let's make sure we did it for these as well, in which we did. Awesome. So it looks like it was just our button icons that we didn't set the naming to focus. Awesome. So there we have both our button and button icon and all their associated variants. Okay, so next let's go ahead and build out our menu component that will be used in things like dropdowns. But before we can go ahead and build our menu component, we do need our menu items themselves, which will be combined together to build one menu component. So let's add in some placeholder text and make sure that's set to body medium, and let's set this to our text body. Let's now go ahead and bring in some icons. So maybe if we go ahead and add in, I don't know, maybe like a lock icon for the right-hand side. You can also adjust the radius of this as well, so it's not so square using the icon library that we're using. And maybe let's go ahead and also bring back in that person. Why not? So very similar to what we did with the field and the button, let's wrap these in an auto layout. Let's set the gap between these to 8. Let's set the horizontal padding to 16 and the vertical padding to 8. Let's now adjust. So let's set this to hug and hug. And actually, because we always want our icon on the right to be right aligned, so it's very similar to what we did with the field, let's set this to fill. Now, let's go ahead and adjust the color. So we have our text body for our placeholder, and maybe we want to spruce up our menu item here and add some color here, even though this will just be our default menu item component for our icons. So for our icons, maybe we can go ahead and add in that icon action. There we go, just to add a little bit of color. Now, we're also going to add a 1 pixel border just on the bottom here. So let's go ahead and apply a variable for border width. Just 1 pixel on the inside, and we're going to set this to our border primary. And you're going to see why we do this in just a sec. And let's make sure we add a surface as well, and this is going to be our surface primary. Okay, so I think we're in some pretty good shape here. Now, what I'm going to go ahead and do is actually just call this dot items. And the reason why we're calling this dot items is because when we create the component of this to prep for our variants, and actually once we have all of our variants together, is we want to avoid having this, or designers being able to pull in the menu items themselves, because they're already going to have a menu component that they can pull in. So why would you need to pull in those menu items? So including a period in the name of the component itself will actually cause this to be hidden in the assets panel. So if you don't want a component showing in the assets panel when a designer is subscribed to your design system, always add that period in the front. And again, if you're confused on this, it'll make a little bit more sense as we actually go ahead and start building out our menu component itself. So we're not done quite yet. Before we add our variances, we do need to add in our placeholder, or not our placeholder, our labels or our properties as well. So let's start off with adding in a label text property component. Oops, did I add that right? Yeah. So let's go ahead and add in a label text property component. So now I can adjust this to pick me, I don't know, something like that. And I can see that the text adjusts with it and that icon stays right aligned. Also too, so very similar to what we did, the field and the button, let's add properties for icon left and icon right, starting with our layer property. So this will be our icon left. And let's also add in our instant swap for icon left. And of course, you can't have properties with the exact same name. So let's go ahead and add that arrow. Icon left, and then icon right. So starting with your layer property, we have an icon right. And let's add an instant swap for that icon right. Emojis and symbols. Search for that arrow. And I do know there's a hotkey for it, but I always like to use edit emojis and symbols. Okay, so I can now on my menu item component, I can adjust that label. I can turn on and off that icon and also swap that out as well. And for the same for our icon right. Let me just check our variables here. So we have our surface, we have our border, 1 pixel on the inside, and we have our icon action, text body, border primary, surface primary. I think we're in some pretty good shape. Okay, so there we have our menu item component. And next what we're going to do is look at adding a variance to this menu item component. Okay, so next let's go ahead and add our variance. So let's go ahead and add a variance. And there's 3 main status variants that we're going to focus on. And we're also going to do selected variants as well. So we have our defaults. Let's move this up. Let's also have a hover. So for our hover, let's go ahead and actually adjust this property 1. So this is going to be our status. And then this is going to be our default. And then this here is going to be our hover. There we go. So for our hover, we're going to change the border primary to our border action hover. We're going to change the surface primary to our surface action hover 2. So it's a little bit lighter. And then our icons are going to become from our icon action to our icon action hover. There we go. And we're going to keep text body the exact same. So we're not going to change that variable at all. Next, let's go ahead and look at our disabled. So when it comes to our disabled, so let's copy our defaults. So for disabled, we're going to set this. Oops, let's change this to disabled. Disabled. Let's change the surface primary to the surface disabled, the border primary to the border disabled, the text body to the text on disabled, and then our icon action to our icon on disabled. And there we have our disabled state. So now when I have a copy a symbol for testing, and Figma, of course, decided to mess around with our properties again. So let's move that label up, that icon left up, that icon left up, and that icon right up. So the icon lefts and the icon rights are together. And I can see I can change between the different statuses for the menu item. Okay, so these here are the menu items that have not been selected. So next what we're going to do is add in another variance for what these menu items would look like if these menu items are actually selected. Okay, so next let's go ahead and add in our type variants. Now, these variants right here, the ones that we just built, these are going to be if our menu item has not been selected. And so the next group that we're going to build is if that menu item actually has been selected. So let's go ahead and add in a new variant that we're going to call type with the first value to be not selected. Okay, so let's then copy each of these down. So let's start up with our defaults, and this is going to be selected. So with our selected, let's go ahead and remove the stroke, and then let's make these a little bit more filled in. So we're going to adjust the surface primary to that surface action. Our text body is going to become our text on action, and our icon action is going to become our icon on action. There we go. That's simple. Let's do something very similar for hover, where this is going to be our selected. Let's change surface action hover 2 to surface action hover. Let's drop that stroke. Let's add from text body, this is going to become our text on action, and then our icon action hover is going to be our icon on action. Then let's do a disabled. Now, we want this disabled to look a little bit darker here. So let's go into our surface. Let's see if we have a darker surface disabled, which we don't. So I'm actually going to go ahead and add in a new variable here for a surface that's going to be our surface disabled selected. So if you have an element that's disabled, that's also been selected, meaning you can't turn that on and off or deselect. So let's go ahead and set this to a neutral color. Maybe we'll go with a neutral 400 for now. We'll try that out. So let's go ahead, drop that stroke, and then set this to our surface disabled selected. And I think that looks pretty good. Let's then go from our icon on disabled to our icon on action, and then our text on disabled to our text on action. And then I think we're in some pretty good shape. So let's go ahead and test this out. So Figma hasn't messed with our properties, so that looks pretty good. So I can see we have our status default, hover, disabled. We also have our type, whether it's not selected or selected. You can adjust the label. You can turn on and off both your icons and also adjust those icons as well. Okay, sweet. So we have all of our menu items all built out. Next, let's look at actually piecing these together into a menu component. Okay, so let's go ahead and build out our menu component using our menu items. Now, when it comes to your menu component, it is pretty common practice to actually set a limit to the number of menu items that you can have in your menu. So we're going to take a very similar approach today. So we have 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 8. So we're only going to have 8 menu items available in our menu. So let's go ahead and call this menu, and I'll elaborate on this in just a sec. So let's create the component of this. So if a designer was to pull in a menu component, you'll notice that they can't actually add any more because it's locked down. What a designer can do to fit their individual use case is use the layers on the left-hand side to show or hide more menu items depending on their particular use case. So that's the same process that we're going to follow today. And then maybe just to keep this nice and clean, let's only show 4 and then just change the type to a second to selected. Okay, so there we have our base menu components, but we're not done quite yet. Let's go ahead and apply a border radius. Look for our radius, set that to 4, and let's apply a stroke, which we're going to be our border primary. Now, one thing that you're noticing here is that all of a sudden, where is my border primary? So let's go ahead and set that to the outside, and there I can see it. But one thing too that you'll notice here is that it's almost like the fill for a menu item is almost going over. So what we can do is hit clip content, and now all of a sudden I can see that is that nice curved radius at each corner. So I think our menu item is looking pretty good. But one thing we'll notice here is if we zoom in, it's almost like we have a double border at the bottom, and that's because our menu components has a border, and also our menu items have that border at the bottom. So what we're going to do to adjust this is set our stroke to the inside, and then what that does is all of a sudden that removes that second, almost like the borders are overlapping, so we no longer have that double border. Perfect. So there we have our menu components, and next what we're going to do is actually look at building out some variants for our menu component. All right, so I know I just mentioned that we're to look at adding our variants for our menu next, but one thing I forgot to add is a scroll bar. Because of course, if you do have 8 menu items, depending on the device size or depending on how your developers build things, you might want to also have that option to add in a scroll bar. So let's go ahead and do that next. So what we're going to do is let's add a quick rectangle here. And let's just set that radius to 50, and let's set the fill to a surface. Maybe we'll go with a border. I think it doesn't really matter the variable that we're using here. Yeah, we'll go with a border disabled, and then let's adjust this very slightly. Let's now go ahead and add an auto layout wrapper here, and let's call this scroll bar. And then let's go into our scroll bar here and change rectangle 1 to scroll bar. Scroll bar, there we go. Now what we're going to do is simply copy and paste this into our menu component itself. Now, one thing we're going to want to do is move this horizontally, the horizontal layout to that way. But look what happens when we do that is because we didn't actually put all of our menu items together all within one auto layout frame. So let's go ahead and add an auto layout frame simply for those menu items that we're going to call menu. And now when we go ahead and add that horizontal layout, for the menu component as a whole, I can see what that does is that puts our menu items on the left and our scroll bar on the right. Now, let's go ahead and set this to fill and then adjust the positioning of it. So maybe we want our scroll bar always at the top And personally, I think that maybe our scroll bar here has a little bit too much space on either side. So maybe let's set that to 4, now too much to 8. And I think maybe we want to move that, see if it's aligned. Yeah, I see that's aligned, so I think we're in some good shape there. Okay, perfect. So we have our scroll bar, and now we always want to set a property for your layer for your scroll bar, because again, depending on the number of menu items that are shown in your menu, you might not want to always have that scroll bar being shown. So let's add in a layer property for scroll bar. And now on our instance, I can turn on and off that scroll bar. Perfect. So we have that all set up. And another thing too that we forgot to do is also add in our nested instances. So let's go ahead and add in those nested instances for each of our individual menu items. There we go. So now when I hit our instance once, I can adjust that scroll bar and also adjust those menu items as well. Okay, perfect. So now that we have our scroll bar added and our nested instance added, now I think we're ready to move on to some variants for our menu. All right, so now let's look at adding some variants to our menu. So let's go ahead and call property one type. You can also call property one indicator. That's another common name for a property that I do often see, but just to keep things consistent across all our other components, we're going to call this type instead of indicator. So our first variant, this is going to be our none, because there's no indicator, I guess, associated with our menu. And then the first variant that we're going to do is actually, let's bring down a tag here real quick, just for naming. So this is going to be our none. So basically just a menu in its purest form. And then we're going to have a drop down. So with the drop down, oops, if I can spell, there we go. So with the drop down, almost pretend as if this menu is associated with a drop down field that's above it. So with that, it's pretty common, so let's call this drop down, to simply just adjust the top radiuses so that they're a little bit more flush. Again, so almost as if it's associated with an input field that's above it. So let's go ahead and simply just adjust these radiuses. Let's set these radiuses to none. There we go. And then that is, I can see that that is a little bit more flush at the top left corner and also the top right corner as well. But our bottom radiuses maintain that curvature. Okay, awesome. So we have our drop down, and let me make sure I named this, which I did. So next what we're going to do is actually look at adding some little arrow indicators to our menu, which is a little bit more complex. Okay, so let's now look at adding one more variant here, and this is going to be if we have a little triangle indicator sitting on the left-hand side for if this menu is associated with a type of element. So if you're not too sure what that looks like, bear with us. So let's set this to left, then let's go ahead and add in a triangle. So let's bring our tag here just for grouping and categorization. And now let's add a triangle. So let's set the surface to surface primary. Let's set the stroke, apply the variable. So our border width is going to be 1, and we're going to set that to our border primary. And now what we're going to do is simply just paste it in. Now, this is going to be a little bit complex and a little bit confusing because we're actually going to be troubleshooting our components. And this is super important because when I see designers building design systems and there's an element that's not working with it, is they always just assume that they built their component wrong. You know, a lot of issues associated with components can actually be troubleshooted. So let's go ahead and use the absolute positioning to position this triangle on the left. And one thing I like to do is always try to keep it as close to in line as possible. It's not always going to be perfect, but let's try to keep it as perfect as we can. Okay, so look what happens is all of a sudden our triangle is in the right position, but it's hidden. And the reason being is we have clip content on. So if we turn that off, all of a sudden is our triangle is now showing, but we lose part of that border. So let's go ahead and troubleshoot this itself. So let's, one thing we're going to try to do here, let's take a closer look where that border is. So I can see our border is at like the main variant level. So if I hit left instead of menu, that border is there. So maybe what we can do is simply remove that. And maybe let's go ahead and apply it at the menu level. But if we apply it at the menu level, then our scroll bar is not going to have that border either. So let's add both our menu and our scroll bar inside of a frame that we're going to call menu. and now go ahead and add that stroke. So I can still see that something's not right there. If I toggle on clip content, all of a sudden I can see that border is now showing. So let's apply the variable. So border width, 1 pixel. Let's set it to the inside for now. And let's set that to our border primary. Now let's go ahead and position and shrink the size of our triangle here. Let's maybe try to get it 24 by 24. There we go. Actually, I think that looks a little bit weird. It looks like I can see that we lost that as we shrunk down. So there we go. Let's set that back to 1. And now I can see, actually, let's be sure to apply our border width variable. Apply the variable. So our border width, set that to 1. I just used the border width there, not the radius. Yeah, so border width. And now I can see that is as such. Okay, so I think we're looking pretty good. And that's a good example as to how you can troubleshoot your components if you don't get the outcome that you're looking for the first time. But one thing I do notice here is all of a sudden we've lost our radiuses as we were going through that process. So let's go ahead and apply the medium radius here. And then I can see that everything looks pretty good. Okay, so let's then go ahead do some quick testing. Let's set that to left. And then when I do that, I can see that also stays in place. But it's always good practice to select and modify your constraint. So this is set to the left. If you were to place this in the center, you would want that set in the center. If this is on the right, you would want that set to the right. Okay, beautiful. So there we have menu components with a little triangle indicator associated with it. If you would like, feel free to go ahead and also do that same process for the center and then also for the right, to spruce up and add to your design system just a little bit more. Okay, so now let's go ahead and actually build out our drop-down component now that we have our menu component. So what we're actually going to do is go back into our local components here and rebuild our input component. So let's add in a label. Let's also add in a field. There we go. And let's also add in our hint copy. Oops, not our hint copy. Sorry, our hint copy is not a component. So let's go ahead and manually add in that hint copy. So let's add in hint copy. Let's set that to our body medium and then our text disabled. There we go. Let's add these in an auto layout wrapper. There we go. Adjust the gap to 8. Call this our dropdown. And now let's go ahead and create the component of this. Now, for your dropdown, what we're actually going to do is just set this main icon here, and this is going to be our chevron. So the reason being is we're recreating the component, so very similar to our input component, is every time a user needs to use a dropdown, you don't want to have them like recreating the input or swapping out the icon for the chevron. It just makes things a whole lot easier as well. And it'll also allow us to introduce a variant for the dropdown. So we'll get to that in just a sec. But first, we need to go ahead and add in some of our properties here. So starting with a layer property for that hint copy. And then let's also add in a text property for the hint copy. Can't have two properties with the same name. Where's our arrow? Bring that down. There we go. So now on our main component here, we can turn that on and off and also adjust to something like hello. There we go. Let's be sure to double check a couple things. Let's set this to hug and let's set this to fill. And then I think we're in some decent shape. So now that we have sort of the foundation for our drop-down component, let's go ahead and start looking at adding our variants. All right, now let's go ahead and add in a variant for our drop-down. So we're only going to have one variant, and this is going to be a type property with the first variant here. This is going to be our default with a lowercase d. Then this one here is going to be our selected. And when it comes to this, what we're going to do is actually just bring in our menu component and then position it at the very bottom. Be sure to set it to fill. And then what we can do is actually go ahead in our menu component and hide some of those menu items. So maybe we only have 4 to start just to keep things nice and concise. Other things that you can do as well to really spruce it up is you can change the status to something like a focus if you'd like to. So it's when it's pulled in, it's already in a focus state. And you can also adjust the icon as well. So it's a chevron up, small, chevron top, small. There we go, to sort of show what that would look like in its more completed state. Perfect. So now if I bring in a copy of our dropdown, I can change it between default and selected. And Figma decided to mess with the order of our properties again. So move that up. And now I can turn on and off that hit copy and also adjust that hit copy as well. So there we go. There we have our completed dropdown. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with our checkbox. So let's go ahead and bring in a check icon. And personally, I don't like my checks to be too square on either side. So I like to add a little bit of a radius here, and we can do that just via the properties. So let's go ahead now and add an auto layout container to our checkbox. Now, this is great because you can adjust the size of your checkbox depending on how large you want it to be. Our icon's already 24 by 24, so I think that's okay. And we're just going to set the horizontal and vertical padding to 0. Let's then add a fill, and this is going to be our surface action. Let's change the color of our checkbox to our icon on action. And let's add a stroke here. So our stroke is going to be on the outside. It is going to be 2 pixels. So border width, set that to our medium, 2 pixels. And this will also be our border action. Let's then adjust the radius to make it a little bit more round. Let's add in a radius of 4. Let's go ahead and call this checkbox. And then I can see that we're already in some pretty good shape. So let's create the component of that. And now all of a sudden we do have our checkbox component. And let's go ahead and start looking at our variants. Let's now go ahead and add our variants. So very similar to what the process that we did in the past here, we're going to add variants such as a hover, focus, disabled, and also an air as well. So that's our default. This will be our hover. And let's change our properties. So this is going to be our status, it's the property 1. And this is going to be our default, and just make that lowercase d. Okay, so we have our hover. We're going to also have a focus. A disabled. And we'll tighten things up a bit here. Bear with me as I get picky. Focus, disabled, and then also an error as well. There we go. So for our hover, we're just going to apply our hover variables. So our fill is going to be our surface action hover, and our border is going to be our border action hover, and the color of our icon is going to stay the same. For our focus, we're going to copy our defaults, change this to our focus, and then as we did with some of our other focus elements, just add that border, that stroke, apply a variable, border width. It's going to be 2 pixels on the outside. Set this to our border focus. And now let's paste this in. There we go. Use the absolute positioning for 2 pixels on either side. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, and then also 1, 2. Be sure to set those constraints to left and right, top and bottom. And then go ahead and apply a radius. Let's apply a radius of 4. See what a radius 8 looks like. It's a little bit too large. I actually kind of like that radius of 8. I think it's a little bit more uniform around the corner. So we're going to roll with that one. So there we have our focus, and always be sure to rename your rectangle to your focus to clean up your layers. Awesome. So there we have our focus. Let's now look at our disabled. So let's bring in one of these, and this is going to be our disabled. Let's go ahead and look at our border. Our border will become our border disabled. Our surface will become our surface disabled. It can also be your disabled selected as well. It just depends on the look that you're going for. So let's go ahead and set that to our surface disabled. And then our icon is going to become our icon on disabled. So there we have our disabled. And now let's do one for our air. So our surface disabled is going to become our surface air, border disabled, border air, icon on disabled will become our icon air. So there we have our initial group of variants that we can toggle in between and choose from. Awesome. So we have our first group of checkbox variants. Next, let's continue on adding more variants. Next, let's go ahead and look at adding some of our different variants. And for our variants, we're also going to have some type variants in the default here that we just created. So these are going to be our selected variants. And we're going to look at our default variants a little bit later on. I know that's usually what we start with for our components is that default. But these are actually going to be our selected. And I'll show you why we started with these a little bit later on, excuse me. So these are going to be are selected, and actually let's move these down. Let's make room here for our defaults. So let's move all these down, and then let's go ahead and leave a row for our default. We'll get to our default after. What we're going to do now is look at our indeterminate variant. Indeterminate. I hope I spelled that right. If I didn't, excuse me. Let's move these, give ourselves a little bit more breathing room. So these are all going to be our selected. And then let's simply copy all of these down for indeterminates. Indeterminate. There we go. Again, I think I spelled that right. But if I didn't, bear with me. So for our indeterminate, all we're going to do is simply swap out the check for a minus or subtract. For a minus, let's see what the small looks like. Let's see what the large looks like. We'll go with the large. So we're going to swap that out for the minus large. There we go, for the focus as well. There we go. Just swap it out. It's a little bit tedious. There we go. So there we have our indeterminate states for each of our checkbox statuses. So we're not done quite yet. Almost done, is we still need to build out our default states for checkboxes and also piece together our checkbox and label together as well. Let's go ahead and look at building out our default variants for our checkbox, or type variants at least. So these are going to be our defaults. And now the reason why we didn't start with our defaults is it's easier to work backwards, just because usually when you're building out a checkbox, if your icon library has an empty icon, so really just an empty frame, you might start with that and then swap that empty frame out for that checkbox icon frame. But because in the icon library that we're using, we don't have that empty icon, we only have the check, we're only going to be working backwards, and it's just a little bit easier for everyone to follow along. So if you're not too sure what I mean, let me show you. So now what I'm going to do, because this is our default, so if that checkbox has not been checked or is not in its indeterminate state, we're just simply going to delete that icon. Okay, so now let's go with a surface primary and then our border primary. Let's then build out our hover. So this is going to be our default type. Status is going to be hover. And then this is going to be our surface action hover 2. And then our border action hover. Let's then look at our focus. So let's bring in our focus, copy that, and paste it around. And it's going to assume the same properties. So we're good there. And then this is going to be our focus hover. Let's then look at our disabled. So this is going to be our disabled. And then we're going to have a surface disabled and then a border disabled. And then we're going to have an error. Oops, this is disabled, not disable. There we go. And then we're simply going to adjust this to our surface error and then our border error. So now in our checkbox, if we copy one of these, we have all the different statuses to choose from. Oops, and we got an error here. So this is error, not arrow. So we have default, hover, focus, disabled, and then error. And we can also turn on whether or not there's any icon inside the box, whether it's selected or indeterminate as well. Awesome. So I think we're in some pretty good shape for our checkbox to actually build out our checkbox label component now. Now let's build out our checkbox label. So let's bring down a copy of our checkbox and let's add some text. Check label. So let's set the text to our body medium and then our fill to our text body. Let's go ahead, add some auto layouts, set the gap to 12. Let's call this our checkbox-label, and then go ahead and create the component of this. Okay, so a couple of things we want to do here, one of which is play around with our resizing constraints, which can be a little bit finicky, so bear with me. So first things first, let's go ahead and add a text property for the label. So now we can easily adjust that label. So check label example, and I can see that adjusts nicely, but we want this set to fill so that it automatically adjusts as planned. When you do that, it sets the horizontal item to fixed. So what happens then is that even if you extended this out, your text doesn't adjust with it. So this is where you kind of got to go in manually and tweak some things, sometimes at the symbol level itself. But anyways, I'll leave you to play around with that. The other thing you want to go ahead and do is add a nested instance. So you can toggle on that checkbox. So now on your symbol, you can choose edit the label and also adjust the status and type of that checkbox as well. And there you go. There you have your checkbox label component.
Thanks for watching today's video, everyone. Just want to encourage everyone to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Your support will go a really long way. And feel free to take a look at all of our other awesome videos as well, covering various topics on design systems and more. If you are building out your design system for your company and do need some help, feel free to give us a shout. We put some links in the description as to where you can get in touch with us, and hope to see you online at UI Collective.